The bridge of the Iron Shrike was dimly lit, a deliberate choice to accommodate the sensitive eyes of its crew. The air hummed with the low thrum of the ship's engines, a sound that Jack had long since learned to tune out. He stood in the captain's chair, or rather, perched on it like a bird ready to take flight. His boots scuffed from years of wear, his jacket patched in places where blaster fire had come too close for comfort. He was human, and by all accounts, he shouldn't have been here. Humans weren't supposed to survive out in the galactic frontier, let alone lead. And yet, here he was, Captain Jack Marlowe, the fragile centerpiece of a crew that could crush him with a flick of their fingers. Jack's crew didn't look at him like he was fragile, though. They looked at him like he was mad, which he probably was, but they followed him anyway. They had to. He wasn't just their captain. He was their edge, their wild card, the one thing that kept them alive when the odds were stacked against them. And in their line of work, the odds were always stacked high. To his left stood Karash, the ship's muscle and enforcer. Karash was a Vornak, a towering, reptilian brute with scales that shimmered like obsidian under the dim light. His four arms crossed over his chest as he leaned against the bulkhead, his tail flicking lazily behind him. Vornaks were known for their strength and their short tempers, but Karash had a strange loyalty to Jack. Maybe it was because Jack had once saved his life during a botched raid on a mining colony. Or maybe it was because Jack had beaten him at cards 3 times in a row and earned his respect through sheer audacity. Next to Karash sat Ryla, the ship's pilot and navigator. Ryla was an Elythian, a species known for their preternatural reflexes and eerie beauty. Her skin glowed faintly in shades of blue and violet, her elongated fingers dancing over the controls with effortless grace. She rarely spoke unless it was necessary, but when she did, her voice carried an almost musical quality that could calm even the most frayed nerves. Jack trusted her implicitly. She had an uncanny knack for finding safe routes through asteroid fields and enemy blockades alike. At the engineering console hunched Grizik, a Grelk who looked like someone had crossed a giant beetle with an octopus and then given it a bad attitude. His chitinous shell gleamed under the faint light as his many appendages tinkered with wires and circuits. Grelks were scavengers by nature, and Grizik was no exception. He could fix anything with whatever scraps were lying around. He grumbled constantly about how humans were soft meat bags, but Jack knew that Grizik would never let anything happen to the Iron Shrike. The ship was as much his home as it was Jack's. Near the back of the bridge stood Sala, their medic and biologist. Sala was an Urin, a towering creature covered in shaggy fur that made her look more like an ancient earth bear than anything else. Despite her intimidating size and claws sharp enough to rend steel, she had a gentle demeanor and a knack for patching up wounds that should have been fatal. She often teased Jack about how often he needed her services. Humans weren't built for this kind of life, after all. And then there was Vex, a shadowy figure who seemed to melt into the darkness of the bridge. Vex was a Shaldari, a race infamous for their stealth and cunning. His smooth black skin absorbed light rather than reflected it, making him nearly invisible when he wanted to be. He served as the Iron Shrike's infiltrator and intelligence officer, slipping into places no one else could reach and gathering information that often made all the difference between life and death. Jack leaned forward in his chair, his sharp green eyes scanning the holographic display in front of him. A blinking red that marked their target, a heavily armed freighter carrying stolen tech from one of the core worlds to some backwater planet on the edge of civilized space. "All right," Jack said, clapping his hands together. "Here's the plan." Karash snorted. "Your plans usually end with us almost dying. And yet," Jack shot back with a grin, "we're still here." Ryla turned her glowing eyes toward him. "You're sure about this? That freighter's got more guns than we've got hull. Which is why we're not going head-on," Jack replied smoothly. "Grizik?" The Grelk clicked his mandibles irritably, but gestured toward the display with one spindly appendage. "I've rigged up an EMP burst we can launch from one of our drones. It'll fry their systems long enough for us to board." "Perfect," Jack said. "Vex?" The Shaldari melted out of the shadows beside him without making a sound. Already working on slicing into their comms, he said in his whispery voice. Good, Jack said before turning to Sala. And you? Sala rumbled softly in what might have been laughter. I'll be ready to pick up whatever pieces are left of you when this goes sideways. Jack grinned again, leaning back in his chair as if he didn't have a care in the world, even though every instinct told him this mission would be dangerous as hell. That's why I keep you around, he said lightly before turning back to face his crew as a whole. Listen up, he barked, his tone suddenly serious. We're pirates, not just any pirates, asterisk the best damn pirates in this sector star. That fritter out there? It's ours now. They just don't know it yet. Karash let out a low growl of approval, while Ryla smirked faintly at her controls. Let's show them what happens when they cross paths with the Iron Shrike, Jack finished. And with that command hanging in the air like an electric charge waiting to explode into action, the Iron Shrike surged forward into its next great adventure, its fragile human captain leading from the front as always. The Iron Shrike descended through the dense atmosphere of the unnamed planet, its hull groaning faintly under the strain. Below, the surface stretched out in endless dunes of crimson sand, broken only by jagged rock formations and glittering mineral deposits that shimmered under the pale light of a dying sun. Jack Marlowe sat in his chair on the bridge, chewing absently on a piece of dried fruit while his crew prepared for their latest venture. The target was simple, a cache of rare metals buried in an abandoned mining outpost. The kind of haul that could keep their ship running for months and their pockets heavy with credits. Ryla, bring us down easy, Jack said, leaning forward as the outpost came into view on the holographic display. It was little more than a cluster of rusted buildings and half-buried equipment, but to Jack, it looked like salvation. Easy is my middle name, Ryla replied, her glowing fingers dancing over the controls. The Elythian's voice was calm, but Jack could see the faint flicker of tension in her luminous eyes. Piloting a ship like the Iron Shrike wasn't just a job, it was an art form. And Ryla was an artist. The ship settled onto the sand with a hiss of hydraulics, its landing struts sinking slightly into the soft ground. Jack stood and adjusted his jacket, turning to address his crew. All right, you know the drill, he said. Karash, you're with me. Grizik, stay here and keep the engines warm. Sala, prep for casualties. Just in case. Casualties? Sala rumbled, her furred face breaking into what might have been a grin. You planning on getting shot again? Not if I can help it, Jack replied with a smirk before turning to Vex. You're our eyes and ears. Make sure no one sneaks up on us. The Shaldari nodded silently and melted into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. Jack led Karash down the loading ramp and into the dry heat of the planet's surface. The Vornak carried a massive plasma cannon slung over one shoulder, his scales glinting like polished stone in the sunlight. Behind them, Ryla joined with her sidearm holstered at her hip, a sleek weapon that looked almost as elegant as she did. The outpost was eerily quiet as they approached, their boots kicking up plumes of red dust with every step. Jack's hand hovered near his own blaster as they entered what had once been a storage facility. Inside were crates upon crates of raw ore and refined metals, exactly what they'd come for. Jackpot, Jack muttered under his breath. But before they could start loading up their haul, a sharp voice rang out behind them. Well now, it said, dripping with mockery. What do we have here? Jack turned slowly to see a squad of space marines standing at the entrance to the facility, their black and gold armor gleaming ominously in the dim light. At their head was a lieutenant, a tall man with sharp features and an even sharper grin. Pirates, the lieutenant said with theatrical disdain. I should have known. Jack's heart sank even as he forced himself to smile. Space Marines were bad news at the best of times, and this wasn't one of those times. Lieutenant, Jack said smoothly, raising his hands in mock surrender. You caught us fair and square. The lieutenant chuckled darkly and stepped closer, his men fanning out behind him with weapons drawn. I'm not interested in catching you, he said. I'm interested in what you're willing to pay to make this little misunderstanding go away. Jack's smile didn't falter, but his mind raced as he calculated their odds. Bribing a space marine was risky enough. Trusting one not to double-cross you afterward was suicidal. We don't have much on us, Jack said carefully, gesturing toward Karash and Ryla, as if they were harmless civilians instead of deadly killers. But maybe we can work something out. The lieutenant's grin widened as he stepped closer still, close enough that Jack could see the greed in his eyes. Oh, I think we can definitely work something. He didn't finish his sentence because Karash's plasma cannon roared to life with a deafening tum, vaporizing half the man's torso in an instant. Chaos erupted. The remaining Marines opened fire immediately, their energy bolts tearing through crates and machinery as Jack dove for cover behind an overturned table. "Karash!" he shouted over the din of battle. "Keep them busy." The Vornak let out a guttural roar and charged forward like an unstoppable force of nature, his cannon spitting death with every step. Ryla ducked behind another crate and returned fire with surgical precision, each shot finding its mark despite the chaos around her. Jack peeked out from cover long enough to take down one Marine with a well-placed shot before ducking back again as return fire scorched past him. "This is why I hate Marines," he yelled to no one in particular. Back on the Iron Shrike, Grizzik's voice crackled over their comms. "What in all voids is going on out there? Change of plans." Jack shouted back as he reloaded his blaster. "Get those engines ready. We're leaving sooner than expected." Salah's voice came next, calm but urgent. "Anyone injured yet?" "Not yet," Jack replied before popping up again to take another shot at their attackers. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. A chaotic blur of cannon fire and shouted orders punctuated by explosions that shook the ground beneath them. Through it all, Jack moved like a man possessed, darting from cover to cover, barking commands that kept his crew coordinated despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Finally, mercifully, the last Marine fell under Karash's relentless assault just as Vex appeared from nowhere to slit another's throat before they could call reinforcements. "Clear!" Vex hissed softly as he wiped his blade clean on one of the fallen Marine's uniforms. Jack straightened slowly from behind his cover and surveyed the carnage around them with grim satisfaction. "Well," he said finally, holstering his blaster with a flourish. "That could have gone worse." The dust settled slowly over the battlefield, the acrid smell of scorched metal and ozone lingering in the air. Jack wiped a smear of blood, someone else's, thankfully, from his cheek and surveyed the wreckage. The once quiet outpost now looked like a war zone. Crates of precious ore lay shattered, their contents spilling across the ground in glittering heaps. The bodies of Space Marines, their black and gold armor scorched and broken, were scattered like discarded toys. Karash stood in the middle of it all, his plasma cannon still humming faintly as it cooled down. The Vornak's chest heaved with exertion, but his reptilian face bore an expression of savage satisfaction. "Weaklings," he growled, kicking the nearest Marine's body with one massive clawed foot. "Easy there, big guy," Jack said, stepping over the remains of a shattered crate. "We've got what we came for, but we need to move. Fast." Ryla emerged from behind her cover, her glowing skin flickering faintly as she holstered her sidearm. "You think they sent out a distress signal?" she asked, her voice calm despite the tension in her posture. Jack nodded grimly. "They always do. The rest of their squadron could be here any minute." He tapped his comlink. "Grizzik, how's my ship?" The Grelk's irritated voice crackled through the comms. "Engines are hot and ready to go, Captain. But if you don't get back here soon, I'm leaving without you." Jack rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress a grin. "You'd never leave me behind, Grizzik." "Try me," came the gruff reply. Jack turned to his crew. "All right, you heard him. Karash, grab as much of that or as you can carry. Ryla, help him load it onto the skiff." "Vex? Where the hell is Vex?" "I'm here," came the whispery voice from directly behind Jack. Jack jumped slightly but recovered quickly, shooting the Shaldari a glare. "Would you stop doing that?" Vex's smooth black face betrayed no emotion as he handed Jack a small data pad. "I accessed their comm logs during the fight," he said quietly. "They've already called for reinforcements." Jack swore under his breath and glanced at the data pad. Sure enough, an encrypted message had been sent to a nearby Space Marine cruiser less than 5 minutes ago. "Damn it," he muttered before looking up at his crew. "Change of plans. Forget loading everything. We grab what we can carry and get out of here now." Karash let out a low growl, but didn't argue, scooping up two massive crates of, or as if they weighed nothing. Ryla grabbed a smaller container and followed him toward the skiff, a battered but reliable hovercraft parked just outside the facility. Sala appeared then, lumbering toward them with her medical kit slung over one shoulder. Her fur was singed in places from near misses during the fight, but she seemed otherwise unscathed. "Anyone need patching up?" she asked in her deep, rumbling voice. "Not yet," Jack replied as he jogged toward the skiff with Vex close behind him. "But stick close, things are about to get hairy." As if on cue, a distant rumble filled the air, a sound that sent a chill down Jack's spine despite the oppressive heat of the planet's surface. "They're here," Ryla said grimly as she climbed into the skiff's driver's seat. Jack didn't need to ask who they were. The Space Marine reinforcements had arrived. "Move!" he shouted, jumping onto the skiff as Karash tossed his crates into the cargo hold with a loud clang. Sala clambered aboard next to him, while Vex melted into the shadows at the back of the vehicle like some kind of living ghost. Ryla hit the controls, and the skiff roared to life, kicking up plumes of red sand as it sped away from the outpost and back toward the Iron Shrike. Behind them, sleek black dropships descended from the sky like predatory birds, their engines screaming as they closed in on their position. "They're gaining on us!" Sala shouted over the roar of wind and engines. Jack grabbed a mounted turret at the rear of the skiff and swung it around to face their pursuers. The weapon was old and temperamental, like most things on the Iron Shrike, but it still packed a punch when it worked. "Keep us steady," he yelled to Ryla before opening fire. The turret spat bolts of searing plasma at their pursuers, forcing one dropship to veer off course as its shields flared brightly under Jack's assault. But there were too many of them. 3 more dropships were closing in fast. "Karash!" Jack shouted without looking back. "Tell me you've got something big in that bag of tricks." The Vornak let out a guttural laugh and reached into one of his many pouches before pulling out what looked like a grenade, but larger and far more dangerous looking. "Plasma charge," he said with a toothy grin before tossing it toward Jack. Jack caught it awkwardly and stared at it for half a second before realizing what Karash wanted him to do. "You're insane," he muttered before arming the device and hurling it toward their pursuers with all his strength. The plasma charge detonated midair with a blinding flash of light and heat that engulfed one dropship entirely while sending another spiraling out of control into a nearby dune. "Two down!" Jack shouted triumphantly as he swung the turret around to target the remaining ship. But before he could fire again, another explosion rocked their skiff, a direct hit from one of their pursuers' weapon systems. "We're hit!" Ryla shouted as she struggled to keep them on course. Jack gritted his teeth and held on tight as smoke poured from one side of the skiff's engine housing. They were so close. The Iron Shrike was just ahead now, its landing ramp extended and waiting for them like an open hand reaching out through chaos. "Almost there!" Jack yelled over his shoulder before turning back to fire another volley at their attackers. The last dropship was relentless, its weapons tearing through sand and rock as it tried to pin them down, but then Vex appeared again like some kind of shadowy phantom. Without saying a word or making a sound louder than a whisper against the windstorm around them, he leapt from their damaged skiff onto one of their attackers' ships mid-flight, and moments later that ship veered wildly off course before exploding spectacularly against another rocky outcropping nearby. "That's my boy!" Jack whooped loudly while gripping tightly onto whatever remained functional aboard their battered escape vehicle, barreling straight toward salvation aboard the Iron Shrike. The skiff screamed across the dunes, leaving a trail of black smoke in its wake as the Iron Shrike loomed larger and larger ahead. Jack clung to the turret, his knuckles white against the grip as he fired one last volley at the remaining dropship. The plasma bolts struck true, punching through its shields and sending it careening into the side of a jagged rock formation. The explosion lit up the crimson sky, a fiery punctuation mark on what had been an already chaotic escape. "Ryla, get us on that ramp," Jack shouted, his voice hoarse from the strain of barking orders and inhaling smoke. "I'm trying," Ryla snapped back, her glowing fingers dancing over the skiff's controls as she fought to keep their battered vehicle steady. The hovercraft groaned under the strain of its damaged engine, but it held together long enough to skid onto the Iron Shrike's loading ramp with a teeth-rattling crash. "Go, go, go!" Jack yelled as he leapt off the skiff and sprinted for the ship's interior. Karash was right behind him, hauling two massive crates of, or as if they weighed nothing. Sala followed with her medical kit slung over one shoulder, her fur singed but otherwise unbothered by the chaos. Ryla abandoned the skiff and darted toward the cockpit while Vex appeared out of nowhere, his black form slipping aboard like a shadow come to life. Back on the bridge, Grizzic was already at the controls, his many appendages moving with frantic precision as he prepared for takeoff. "Took you long enough," he growled without looking up. "I was about to leave your sorry hides behind." "You love us too much to do that," Jack shot back as he slid into his captain's chair. "Now get us out of here, before more Marines show up." The Grelk muttered something unflattering under his breath, but complied, slamming a lever forward and sending the Iron Shrike rocketing skyward. The ship shuddered violently as it broke through the planet's atmosphere, its hull groaning under the strain of rapid ascent. "Incoming fire!" Ryla called from her station, her luminous eyes scanning a holographic display that showed two Navy frigates closing in fast. "Shields up!" Jack ordered. "Karash, get to the guns." "Grizzic, give me everything you've got in those engines." The Vornak let out a guttural laugh as he lumbered toward one of the ship's turrets. "Time to show these Navy dogs what real firepower looks like." Grizzic muttered something about overheating coils, but pushed the engines to their limit anyway, sending the Iron Shrike hurtling toward open space at breakneck speed. Jack watched the holographic display intently as enemy fire streaked past them, narrowly missing their hull. "Vex," he said without looking up, "tell me you've got something clever up your sleeve." The Shaldari materialized beside him like a ghost. "I've already sliced into their targeting systems," he said in his whispery voice. "They'll be shooting blind for at least 30 seconds. "Good man," Jack said with a grin before turning back to Ryla. "Plot us a course out of here, somewhere far away from Navy patrols." "I'm working on it," she replied tersely, her fingers flying over her console. Meanwhile, Karash was having the time of his life in one of the Iron Shrike's gunner seats. The Vornak let out a roar of triumph as he scored a direct hit on one of the frigate's engines, causing it to veer off course in a trail of smoke and debris. "One down," Karash bellowed over the comms. "Don't get cocky," Jack warned him. "We've still got another one on our tail." But before that second frigate could close in for another attack run, Ryla's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Course plotted. Jumping to hyperspace in 3, 2, 1. With a deafening roar and a flash of blinding light, the Iron Shrike tore through space and vanished into hyperspace just as another volley of enemy fire streaked past where they'd been moments before. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the ship's engines as they hurtled through hyperspace toward safety. Finally, Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and leaned back in his chair with a relieved grin. "Well," he said lightly, "that went better than expected." Karash's laughter boomed over the comms. "Better? We just took down half a squadron of Space Marines and lived to tell about it. This is why I follow you, Captain. You're insane." Jack chuckled, but didn't argue. Instead, he turned to Ryla. "How far are we from our next stop?" "Far enough," she replied with a faint smile. "We should have plenty of time to patch up before we run into any more trouble." "Good," Jack said before turning to Grizzic. "How's my ship?" "Battered, but not broken," the Grelk grumbled as he fiddled with some controls. "Same as always." Jack nodded and stood from his chair before addressing his crew as a whole. "All right, everyone, take 5. We've earned it." As his crew dispersed to tend to their various duties, or in Karash's case, celebrate their victory with an enormous mug of something foul-smelling, Jack made his way down to the cargo hold where their haul was being stored. He ran a hand over one of the crates and smiled faintly. It wasn't just about the ore or even about surviving another day. It was about proving something, to himself, to his crew, and now apparently to the entire galaxy. Because word would spread, he knew it would. The Space Marines didn't lose often, and when they did, people noticed. Sure enough, within days of their escape from that nameless planet, reports began circulating across intergalactic channels. A human pirate captain had not only bested an elite squadron of space marines, but had also looted one of their ships for good measure before vanishing without a trace. It was unheard of, and it didn't go unnoticed by those in power. In high command centers across countless star systems, admirals and generals began whispering about this Captain Marlowe and his ragtag crew, a human who had somehow managed to lead aliens stronger and smarter than himself into battle after battle, and come out victorious every time. And while some dismissed him as nothing more than an anomaly, a lucky fool who would eventually run out of luck, others saw something more. Proof that humans were more than just fragile creatures clinging desperately to survival on their insignificant little planet. They were leaders, wild cards who could turn even impossible odds into victories through sheer audacity and determination. And whether they liked it or not, humanity's star was beginning to rise. The Iron Shrike drifted silently in the void, its once pristine hull now a patchwork of scars. Each dent, scorch mark, and welded testament to decades of battles, heists, and narrow escapes. Inside the ship, the air was quieter than it had been in years. The hum of the engines was steady, but the voices that had once filled its corridors with laughter, arguments, and plans for impossible capers were subdued. This was their last voyage together. Everyone knew it, though no one had said it out loud. Not yet. Jack Marlowe sat in his captain's chair on the bridge, staring out at the endless stars. He was older now, his once boyish face lined with age and experience. His green eyes still burned with that sharp intelligence and audacity that had carried him through countless dangers. But there was a weight to them now, a heaviness that came with knowing this chapter of his life was coming to an end. Behind him, Karash leaned against the bulkhead, his four massive arms crossed over his chest. The Vornak scales had dulled over the years, and there were scars crisscrossing his body that even his species' formidable healing abilities couldn't erase. But his presence was as imposing as ever. He'd been Jack's enforcer, his shield in countless firefights, and more than that, he'd been a friend. "You're really going through with this," Karash rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. Jack didn't turn around. "We've earned it," he said simply. Karash snorted. "Speak for yourself. I've got at least another decade of fight left in me." "Sure you do," Jack replied with a faint smile. "But even you can't outrun time forever." The door to the bridge slid open with a soft hiss, and Ruthless stepped inside. The Elythian pilot moved with her usual grace, though there was a stiffness to her movements now, a reminder of the injuries she'd sustained during their raid on the Zynar Syndicate's orbital vault 5 years ago. Her glowing skin had dimmed slightly over the years, but her sharp wit hadn't dulled one bit. "Course is set," she said as she slid into the co-pilot seat. "One last jump before we scatter to the winds." Jack glanced at her. "You sound almost sad about it." Ruthless shrugged, her luminous eyes fixed on the controls. "I'll miss this ship," she admitted after a moment. "I'll miss you idiots." Karash let out a bark of laughter. "Idiots? Speak for yourself." "Don't make me shoot you," Ruthless retorted without missing a beat. Jack chuckled softly, but didn't say anything more. He knew they were all feeling it, the bittersweet ache of saying goodbye to something that had defined their lives for so long. In the cargo hold below, Grizik was busy tinkering with one of the ship's many systems, a habit he'd never broken despite their impending retirement. The Grelk's chitinous shell was cracked in places from years of wear and tear, and his mandibles clicked softly as he muttered to himself. "Stupid me bags," he grumbled as he adjusted a panel that didn't really need fixing. "Always breaking things, leaving me with all the work." Sala appeared behind him, her towering furred form casting a long shadow over the hold. The Uran medic's once shaggy coat had grown thinner with age, but her gentle demeanor remained unchanged. "You're going to miss them," she said quietly. Grizik clicked his mandibles again, but didn't look up from his work. "I'll miss my tools," he said stubbornly. "Not them." Sala chuckled softly and patted him on the shoulder with one massive paw before heading back toward her quarters to pack what few belongings she planned to take with her when they reached their destination. And then there was Vex, the elusive Shaldari, who had always been more shadow than man. No one knew exactly where he was at any given moment. Even now, on their final journey together, he seemed to melt into the background like a ghost haunting the Iron Shrike. But Jack knew he was there, watching silently as always. Their final destination wasn't some grand treasure or daring raid. It was a quiet starport on the edge of known space where they could each go their separate ways without drawing attention from old enemies or curious authorities. The docking process was uneventful, almost anticlimactic compared to everything they'd been through together. But Jack supposed that was fitting in its own way. Not every ending needed explosions or fanfare. One by one, they gathered in the cargo hold for what would be their last meeting as a crew. Karash was the first to speak, a rarity for him. "You're all fools," he said bluntly before turning to Jack specifically. "But you're the biggest fool of all." There was no malice in his tone, only respect and something that might have been affection. "I'll take that as a compliment," Jack replied with a grin. Ryla stepped forward next, her expression softer than usual. "You kept us alive when no one else could have," she said simply. "Don't let it go to your head." Grizzic muttered something incomprehensible under his breath, but eventually added, "You weren't completely useless." Even Vex emerged from wherever he'd been hiding long enough to offer Jack a rare nod of approval before slipping away again like smoke on the wind. Finally, Sala stepped forward and placed one massive paw on Jack's shoulder, a gesture that felt almost parental despite their many arguments over the years about his reckless behavior. "You're not just our captain," she said quietly. "You're our family." For once, Jack didn't have anything clever or sarcastic to say in response. He just nodded and swallowed hard against the lump forming in his throat. One by one, they left, each heading off toward whatever futures awaited them on their home planets or elsewhere among the stars. Karash returned to Vornak Prime to take up his place as an elder among his people, a warrior who had seen more battles than most could imagine. Ryla disappeared into a Lithian space without saying exactly where she was going, but Jack suspected she'd find herself another ship to fly before long. Piloting was in her blood. Grizzic grumbled about being dragged into retirement, but eventually settled on a small moon where he could tinker with machines in peace without anyone bothering him. Sala returned to her Urin clan, a healer among warriors who would undoubtedly benefit from her wisdom and experience. And Vex? No one knew where Vex went, not even Jack, but somehow that felt right. The Shaldari had always been an enigma wrapped in shadows. Why should that change now? Jack stayed behind aboard the Iron Shrike, alone for the first time in decades as he watched them disappear into the stars one by one, until only silence remained aboard his beloved ship. He leaned back in his chair on the bridge, the same chair where he'd planned so many insane adventures, and allowed himself a small smile despite the ache in his chest. They would never forget him, just as he would never forget them. Karash's strength, Ryla's precision, Grizzic's ingenuity, Sala's compassion, Vex's quiet cunning. And through it all, Jack Marlowe, fragile human captain who had led them through fire and fury. Not because he was stronger or smarter than them, but because he refused to give up when others would have faltered. The stars stretched out before him, endless possibilities waiting just beyond reach. And though this chapter of his life had ended, he couldn't help but wonder if there might still be another adventure waiting out there for him someday.